We left off part 1 with the model being built and all the small pieces set aside for paint. And the first step in painting is to prime everything, and I like to prime all the individual pieces separately and then assemble the model later. I primed everything with MIG one-shot primer, and I really like it. I think it lays down super smooth, and I believe that's going to be my go-to primer for now on. Although the Tamiya fine rattle can primer is also very useful. I like that as well. Running gear, the inside of the fenders, and I'm using Hull Red, Vallejo Hull Red, as a substitute for red oxide primer. After spraying Hull Red on the lower part of the chassis, I then start painting all the loose parts with the Dunkelgelb base coat. Once the Hull Red and the inside of the wheels has dried for 24 hours, I can then flip the wheels over and paint the superstructure of the Jagdtiger with the Dunkelgelb base coat. I now have the Dunkelgelb base coat on all the parts of the model that get that color. To paint the tracks, I first use a dark rust Vallejo paint and sponge paint the tracks, and then I follow that up with a lighter medium rust color and sponge paint the tracks again. Once the tracks are painted with the two rust colors, I can then apply MIG dry earth. I try not to apply the dry earth too heavy. I want all the track detail to show, and if I don't have the track links completely coated in dry earth, that's okay, because our rust colors can show through. And once I get the tracks coated, I also add in a little bit of wet earth to get a little tonal variety. I made up 8 spare track links and painted those up and added some rust hues so it looks like they've been out in the weather for a while. At this point in the painting process, I apply a satin clear to protect the base coat. After the clear is dried for 24 hours, I can tape off the model, and I'm going to apply Vallejo chipping medium. The reason for applying the chipping medium is I want to chip the individual camouflage colors. I would like to paint this model and weather it so it looks like it's been in the field for a while. I mix the Vallejo chipping medium about 50-50 with Tamiya X20A. I found that viscosity, it would spray well through my Badger Patriot airbrush. Once the chipping medium was sprayed on the model and allowed to dry, as soon as it was dry, I sprayed on the green camouflage color. After spraying the green camouflage color, I quickly cleaned my airbrush and then starting to chip the green camo using tap water and a soft brush. With the amount of chipping medium I applied, I had to be careful not to over chip the model because the paint came off very easily. And I don't want a crazy chip, I just want some subtle chips. The barrel was the exception. I have a plan for the barrel that requires it to be heavily chipped. So I went ahead and was a little more aggressive with the barrel and took more paint off. Now the next thing I did was apply a pin wash to the road wheels, the idler, and the drive sprockets. After the green camouflage had dried for 24 hours, I applied a coat of L-Clad Aquagloss Clear. That would allow me to use water on the brown camouflage without affecting the Dunkelgelb base coat and the green camouflage. I decided to use some aftermarket tow cables on the model, and I wanted to string them in kind of a creative way to give it a little bit of flair. So I took the Eureka cables and I cut them the length of the molded cables. And then what I did is I drilled out the cleaning rod brackets so that I could string the Eureka cables through the brackets. And I reused the cable ends, and I drilled them out so that I could insert the cables into the loops. I remembered I had some 3D tool clamps in my stash, so I decided that this would be a great time to use some of those. And so I installed some of the clamps, and it really does improve the look of the model. And I'm hoping now that once I get some paint on the model, they'll really stand out. Here I have one of the tool clamps on the shovel. I removed the molded-on clamps and attached some more of the 3D clamps to the pry bar and the starter crank. And I also attached some of the cable brackets. Now it's time for another coat of chipping medium and the brown camouflage color. I like to use a drawing when painting my camouflage. First of all, it's interesting to try to recreate an actual tank. And secondly, I just find it a lot easier. I have the brown camouflage on, and I use the same process as with the green. That after the brown camouflage was applied, I cleaned my airbrush, and after that was done, I used some tap water and a soft bristle brush and started chipping the brown paint. The decals in this kit are very thick. So what I decided to do is trim away all of the film around the numbers and the crosses to try to minimize that appearance of thickness. I made an alignment template from blue painter's tape, and what that template would allow me to do is apply the decals so that they're straight. I have all the decals applied, and by trimming the decals tightly against the graphic, it definitely helps try to hide how thick the decals are. I temporarily attach the fenders with a couple drops of super glue. I need the fenders in place for the final clear coat. I've chipped the model using a sponge and a brush. I feel like there's a place for each of those. And I heavily chipped the gun barrel. Here I'm getting ready to start chipping the wheels, chipping the road wheels, the drive sprockets, and the return idlers. And this was all done with a brush. And now it's time for the final clear coat. And I went ahead and used a dead flat clear. I didn't clear the tracks or the spare track links, but the rest of the model's been cleared, and it's time for weathering. I used a thick mud paste to build up some texture on the chassis and the suspension components. I let that mud paste dry for about half a day before I started applying the dry earth. I coated the mud paste with the dry earth and then used a brush and stippled the dry earth into the mud paste where it mixed a little bit and created some nice texture. I then took a brush with some enamel thinner and streaked the bottom of the chassis. Once I had the mud and dirt on the chassis, I then started applying dry earth to the road wheels, drive sprocket, and the idlers. I applied more dry earth to the inside road wheels. My thinking was they would accumulate more dirt and mud. I added grease and oil stains to several of the road wheels. I kept the outside road wheels cleaner. Number one, I felt that they would stay cleaner in normal use. Plus, I just wanted to show off the chipping. Once all the wheels are in place, I installed the tracks. I used a little drop of super glue on the bottom of each of the road wheels to glue the track to the road wheels. Since the suspension arms are in different positions, I want to make sure the tracks are tightly stuck to the bottom of the road wheels so I don't have any gaps. And once the tracks were installed, I could then permanently install the fenders. I added 3 kill rings to the barrel, and then I chipped away the kill rings progressively from the first kill ring to the fresher third kill ring. I thought that might be interesting, a little visual that, it's kind of subtle. And since the barrel is heavily chipped, I just thought it would fit. It's time for the pin wash. The pin wash is absolutely my favorite detailing technique. Now, it's a long process. It took me 8 hours to apply the pin wash to this Jagdtiger, but it's just so worth it. I used MIG oil paint and some odorless mineral spirits and a 2-0 brush. And I used the same brush for everything, applying the pin wash and then wiping away the excess. And it's so enjoyable how the pin wash just brings all those small, tiny, almost invisible details. It brings them up and makes them visible. A guy could stop after the pin wash and have a really nice model. Time to paint some of the parts on the back of the tank. Time to rust up the exhaust, add a little detail to the jack, and a little bit of detail to the jacking block. And my final weathering step, be using oil paints to change the tone of the paint. I'm going to fade the tops, the top of the superstructure, top of the fenders, a few pieces on the engine deck, and around the driver and radio operator hatches to make those very light and kind of washed out. I brightened up the red oxide primer a little bit. And here I got some dots on the top, And this is a very pale yellow. And what I'll do is I'll just use a brush and I'll blend that into the paint and fade out the top of the tank. As I work my way down the sides, I get progressively darker in my hues. And so I got the top of the tank is faded, and by the time I get to the bottom of the superstructure, it'll be significantly darker. I faded the top of the fenders, any place that would get direct sunlight I faded. And in the back of the superstructure, the lower part below the hatches, that was all blended in with some dark brown paint. I used dry earth again and added mud splashes where the fenders were missing. And once I had the dry earth applied, I used some enamel thinner and a brush and streaked it. And once the streaking was done, I went ahead and speckled the area. I didn't apply the mud and speckling too high, where the fenders were missing or in the back, because the Jagdtiger is a big old beast and it's not a speedy machine. So as the tank treads go around, they're going around fairly slow, and it will sling up some mud, but it's not going to throw it up onto the top of the tank. Once I had my color gradient applied where the top of the structure was very light and faded to where it came down it was dark at the bottom, I then went back onto the top edge and I mixed up a real pale gray and added some rain streaks. Once I finished with the oil paints, I added the spare tracks. I added the commander figure that I painted up. I'll go over the commander figure a little bit in the next video where we put the model on the display base. There may be some areas of the model that I touch up as I look it over, but for the most part, I'm going to consider the model built. And coming up here in a few seconds, I have a bunch of pictures of the finished model. I hope you enjoy them, and thanks very much for watching.